Hello. I'm going to talk today about the whitewashing of history, like um, ancient history, especially. I mean, that's what I focus on more, know more about. Um, so, yeah, basically, I didn't realize the full extent of whitewashing, like obviously I knew that, they get American actors to play pharaohs and Aztecs and you know different types of American Indians and Japanese samurai, and they just get white Americans to play like everything, and then they often in art, like Western art, they'll portray those people as basically white, or you know very close to white. And I mean, to an extent, I mean, it's like the same thing as with Jesus, like they have the blonde, blue eyed Jesus of Europe and I guess the US probably. And so, as far as Jesus, like, I mean, I don't really know. I think Jesus was, for the most part, invented, but at the very least, if there was a Judean man named Jesus, he probably would, there's very little to no chance he would have blonde hair or blue eyes. And chances are he would be black, or at least what we in America would call black. You know, I mean, black is a color, and so if you, like some people want to say like, oh no, the none of the pharaohs were black because they weren't the literal color black. Like they're not usually not depicted. Some of them are depicted probably with a literal color, but usually they're just depicted as, very dark brown, like what, like color of like Martin Luther King, or maybe darker, often darker. And they say, oh, well, that's not black. White people say this, or sometimes Egyptians say this, who are basically anti-black Egyptians who don't understand Western terminology. So somehow they think that black literally means black, like that if anybody who's not literally black, the color, like anybody who's brown is therefore not black. But that's just a misunderstanding of terminology. Um, like the pharaohs were very dark skinned, and like I didn't really realize how much it was whitewashed until I really started looking into it, because I've been actually, I started actually studying Egypt about 3 years ago or so, like zeroing in on it. And so a lot of stuff that I saw, like in Google search results, Google image search, etc., and like different websites about it, and even some books about it, is like you mostly see Egyptian art that has no paint on it, like no paint for the skin color, and it seems that the oftentimes the paint they used for skin color was the most fragile paint that they used, or was relatively fragile. So often, the paint for the hair would remain, or some other, or the clothes or something, but the skin paint uh, wears off, and also is worn off, is like chipped off. That's what I found out eventually, was that even in ancient times, if the paint on a statue, or maybe even a bas relief or something, like started to chip, they would just often chip off the rest of it. And I think, what I read about this was that it's for aesthetic purity. So they're saying like they don't want it to look chipped, so they'd rather just have no paint than chipped paint. So that I can understand. I don't know if it ever had racial motivation in ancient times, but certainly in modern times, there's been a racial component to just the fact that people, a lot of Westerners, prefer ancient art that doesn't have paint on it. Because, like, all the ancient statues were all painted. I don't think there is any ancient statue that was not painted, at least like a prominent statue. Like, all the statues we think of as like the Roman and Greek marble with the which of course marble, if it's white marble, a lot of times that gave the impression that the Greeks and Romans were white, in the sense that, like, in the way that I'm white, like very, light skin. But that's not true. They were not white. Like, mm, there may have been white Greek and Romans, but there were also a lot of dark skinned Greek and Romans, and their statues were and their paintings were depicted as such. And we rarely are shown the ones that have paint on them. And that's certainly the case with Egypt. Like, I I've looked through thousands probably of photos, from ancient Egypt online. And I mean, I would say there are thousands of whitewashed photos and, whitewashed art of ancient Egypt, either like just wholesale, reconstructions where they just do their own painting and they say it's like based on the ancient Egyptian style and everything, but it's, white people, or it's the ancient paintings that have no paint left on them, or it's the ancient paintings, whitewashed and either like digitally or otherwise whitened. Um, so yeah, like I had this impression of this like extremely diverse, I guess, ancient Egypt, where there was apparently a lot of white people, but then somehow there was also, like black people, because, sometimes the other stuff gets through. Like I saw some art of ancient Egyptian art of people that were clearly black. Um, so I started thinking like, okay, I guess it was like multiracial society. Um, and then I learned, from my friends, from people who were studying this before me, that that I was wrong, that like that Egyptians were black, like ancient Egyptians were black, um and that all these white, seemingly white statues and paintings and whatever are whitewashed. And, there might be some that were, lighter skinned, like more towards the end, like Greco-Roman, like basically, yeah, when Egypt was a European colony. Um, that may be, I'm not really sure. I mean, it seems like the majority of ones that do look light skinned, like ancient Egyptian art that does look light skinned, that doesn't look like it's like the paint is worn off, that looks like it's the original paint. I would say pretty much 100% of those are Greco-Roman. There's none of them like that I can think of that are before Greco-Roman, especially depicting men. Like women tended to be depicted lighter skin, just as a this is part of the tradition, I think, because they, were thought to like maybe stay inside so they didn't get as much sun. Um, but men were pretty much universally depicted as quite dark and generally darker than a lot of people, a lot of Americans who are black and who are considered black and universally thought of as such. So, so yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, of course, here I'm just talking about it. I'm not like showing the evidence per se, but you can Google, look up. I would say if you want to see like the original, what the original ancient Egyptian art and depictions of themselves looked like, Google Old Kingdom tombs, Old Kingdom tombs. You can Google Saqqara, or yeah, I think maybe Saqqara, Saqqara. I think they found some new tombs there, and that's where I saw like that's where I first really came into contact with like this phenomenon, which is the fact that in the tombs, the paint, you can find uh, places where the paint is more intact. Like, I don't think there's any ancient, or there might not be any ancient, at least Old Kingdom paintings that have all the paint intact. But clearly, there's a lot more of the paint, it's a lot less faded inside the tombs because it's the sun um, that fades it, seems to be, because it's only inside the tombs and sometimes on the underside of ceilings. Anything that has no contact with the sun, that's where you see like the original paint. And they're very dark people. you know Features seem very African. um you know Hair African, curly hair or braids is pretty much almost universal in ancient Egyptian art, that everybody from the pharaoh to everybody else depicted with curly hair or braids. And the Egyptian hair is depicted exactly the same as the Nubian hair is in ancient art. So and the same thing happened in the Americas, where there's so many depictions of like Aztecs and Mayans that try to make them look super light skinned. But if you look at most of their original art, most of it, if you can, especially if it's really retaining its original paint, they will tend to be very dark skinned, and sometimes basically black, like the literal color black, and other times just very dark brown. And so yeah, there's been endless examples of the whitewashing of American Indians too. You know, some of that is by people who are like, Latin Americans, mestizos, and kind of identify as Aztec maybe. And so they kind of want to think, they don't want to, like, they want to identify as Aztec, but they don't want to realize that Aztecs didn't look anything like them. Like people who are basically light skinned, and they don't want to, they want to, this is real cultural appropriation. Like, not just, I mean, I'm all for people like, dabbling in each other's cultures if they do it respectfully. But real cultural appropriation is when you not only take their culture, but then you claim that it's yours. Like, you claim you invented it. It's like they, yeah, so they do that with Egypt. I mean, there's so many people, they cannot stand to, for anybody to say that the pharaohs were black. Um, they have, they now have some go-to article because there was some study done a few years ago on like one mummy or something like that, and they determined that they had some similarity in their DNA with some ancient fossils from like Anatolia or Armenia or something like that. So therefore, all these people say, "Oh, okay, that means the pharaohs were white." Like, first of all, we know the pharaohs were black because they all had paintings of themselves, like painted all over the place of black men, you know, dark skin, curly hair, black men. And so, I mean, if anything, that would prove that, the Armenians and the Anatolians were black as well, which I think, there's a lot to be said for that. But really it's just like a very isolated sample, and like I think it might just be from one individual. And people don't know how to interpret DNA. Like they were going off of one aspect of the DNA to say it had some similarity with some of these ancient Anatolians. But again, like we don't know who was in Anatolia in those times. Like we don't know what they looked like either. We just have their DNA. Um, and plus, it's very easy for a genome to have some similarity, like some particular gene or trait that's in common with somebody without that meaning anything. I mean, you have like a million trillion genes, so you might have one that's in common with something. It doesn't define your entire ancestry. Um, but I do think that, uh, oh, and, the same thing like the whitewashing of the Middle East, like in the ancient Middle East, people were, I mean, I don't know to say whether were people black. I think a lot of black people were in the Middle East in ancient times. And I would say that at the very least, the majority of Middle Easterners or a lot of the people who were influential in the Middle East during the Bronze Age and later, um, were at the very least part black, maybe half black, and maybe 100%. Um, because, they had, uh, I look at curly hair as a huge determinator, determinative. Like that, that's a huge sign because, you know, um, I mean, in one type of old usage of the term black, you could say like, they called Australian Aborigines black. They called people in India black. Sometimes they called the American Indians black. So in that sense, the world was black for the most part. Like whiteness seems to be relatively recent, as far as, if we're going to go off DNA, they say that the modern white gene mutation arose like maybe 7,000 years ago or less, and then steadily, like spread around from wherever it started. So, all these civilizations, like Egyptian civilization, was already basically going 7,000 years ago. They already had like the Nakada, and they already had a lot of the traditions that, led to the pharaonic culture. Um, so, so Europe has been totally whitewashed too. Like ancient Europe steadily been whitened, like over time, I think, like especially in, well, yeah, like the original Europeans are thought to have been dark skinned based on their DNA, and the like the Yamnaya, who are kind of like probably the Aryan Europeans, who were seem to have been at least largely white or partly white or maybe entirely white. They came from Asia. They came from Ukraine about 4,000 years ago and conquered Europe and basically wiped out like all the dark-skinned native Europeans, all the men at least, and then basically raped all the women. And, that's modern Europe. Modern Europeans are descended from those conquerors and their offspring. Um, so if you look at like early Greek art, early Roman art, you see a lot of black people and you see a lot of brown people. You see like a lot of people of color, let's say, who are Greek and Roman. Um, and if you look at a map of curly hair, um, because people say, well, you can't say the world was black because, like Indians, a lot of Indians had straight hair or have straight hair, so they're not black. People say that, like, okay, but if we go off that, if we say, like, quote unquote, like Africanoid black, um, which is dark skin with curly hair, then you can see how curly hair, like on a map of where curly hair is, you can see it emanate from Africa. You can see that, Arabia is, uh, you know, has lots of curly hair, and, the Middle East generally, and then Europe. So it's like Africa, the Middle East, and Europe are the most curly haired places in the world, other than like uh, Papua New Guinea and maybe Australia and maybe parts of Polynesia, like Melanesia, which are potentially from the same origin as well, because there's a pretty direct route from Madagascar and whatnot, uh, eastward to Papua and to Fiji and all these places. Um, so like we're all descended. I think everybody, like at least Europeans, are probably all descended from black people to some extent. And the curly your hair is, then probably the more uh, black African ancestry you have. Um, it's like if you look at ancient paintings in Mesopotamia, like the Babylonian paintings, they painted even their gods with, very curly hair, curly beards, and with dark skin, like dark reddish skin, um, similar to the Egyptian color that a lot of pharaohs and stuff were painted. I'm not sure if it was exactly as dark as the pharaohs were painted or not, but I'm saying, like, if the Mesopotamians were depicting their gods as, you know, dark skin with curly hair, then that suggests that at the very least, black people and their descendants were hugely influential in Mesopotamia. And, I mean, like, they often talk about how, like, climate, they say, well, okay, white people are adapted to the climate of the North or something, which I think is very debatable because, as I say, it seems that whiteness originated 7,000 years ago, whereas, if anything, it's been getting warmer during this time, like, so, um, and if you go to Siberia, if you go to Alaska, if you go to Greenland, you see very dark skinned people who have lived there for thousands of years. So there's no evidence that humans naturally become white in cold places. But at the very least, if they're going to hold to that theory that like whiteness is natural and whiteness like is climate based, then they should admit that Arabians are black. They should, or that at least that the ancient Arabians were black, because if you look at the Arabian Peninsula, it goes as far south as like, Ethiopia or maybe Kenya or something. It goes very far south. And in many ways, it's part of Africa. Like the Arabian Peninsula has a lot of the same animals and plants as Africa. It's just divided by the Red Sea. Um, and especially Palestine is very much, Palestine is basically part of the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. So based on that, it should be expected that Arabs were black, and I think they largely were. Um, like people get hung up on because they say, well, that's not the black that I think of. Like when I think of black, I think of this or that. It doesn't matter what you think of. It just matters that if those people were here today in America, they would be called black. You know, like if they have an afro, you have dark skin, you have full lips, then it doesn't matter if you're, like they get hung up on the nose shape because they say, okay, well, if somebody's nose isn't wide enough, then they're not really black. That's not a real thing. That's really not a real thing. There's tons of black people with all kinds of noses. It's just like white people, like there's different phenotypes within it. And there's a lot more different phenotypes within black people than within white people. So, yeah, there's nothing, if somebody does have like a thin nose or a long nose, that doesn't make them white. There's a lot of non-white people that have those features and always have, and arguably, um, was mostly non-white people with those features, especially before this modern white mutation arose like 7,000 years ago, because before that there were already a great variety of facial structures. So yeah, like I think it's a total disgrace, in this time that's supposed to be so woke, and we have like, Juneteenth is a holiday, national holiday, and I don't know, like I just feel like it's so fake the way that the government and the ruling class, they're willing to like go through the motions of being non-racist or being anti-racist, but it's nothing like there. You still have like most of the people in the US and the world think that like the pharaohs were white, or at least like they don't think the pharaohs were black, and they were, like they can't fathom that. So I feel like, we still live in a deeply racist society, and like, I mean, we live in a society that basically devours everybody. It doesn't really, it's not like, you know, it really cares about anybody, but it's definitely deeply racist when it comes to history and the history of black people, and certainly the history of Egypt, the history um, of Europe and the Middle East in terms of the color. Um, and yeah, the same thing happens with the American Indian depictions, and a lot of modern day American Indians are are white, basically, or descendants of, like me. I'm like a little part Cherokee, but I'm basically white. I'm 90%, over 90% European. Um, but like I don't live on the res or anything. But even a lot of the people who do live on the res and are chiefs and everything like that are basically white. And like I'm not against that. Like that's like, if they were brought into the nation, I mean, I'm against how they kicked black people out of the Cherokees, etc. But I'm not against people identifying with some part of their ancestry that they want to, carry on